I used to think there was a difference between being understood and being known. Understanding, I thought, was something people earned through time, through conversations, through explanations, through all the small details that slowly reveal who a person is when no one is asking them to perform. Being known was different. Being known meant someone had stayed long enough to see what existed underneath everything you showed the world, the contradictions, the silences, the parts that didn't make sense from the outside, the things you did without realizing you were doing them, the things you avoided explaining because explaining them would make them smaller. I believed that kind of knowledge required history, years, maybe shared experiences, mistakes, arguments, long conversations at inconvenient hours, moment where there was no reason left to pretend. I believed familiarity had to be built, piece by piece, slowly, almost painfully, and then you appeared, and somehow you made one of the things I believed most strongly feel incomplete, because you didn't know my history. You didn't have years of evidence. You didn't have every version of me stored somewhere in your memory. You didn't watch me become who I am. And yet there were moments when the way you responded to me felt strangely familiar. Not familiar in the ordinary sense. Not like someone remembering something I told them. More like someone recognizing something I'd never said. That difference stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Long after the words themselves stopped mattering. I kept thinking about the feeling underneath them. That strange sensation of being recognized without having introduced yourself completely. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. I tried to make it smaller. I told myself people notice patterns, people are perceptive. Sometimes two people simply communicate in similar ways. Sometimes silence means the same thing to two different people. Sometimes coincidence is more convincing than it deserves to be. I gave myself every reasonable explanation, and for a while, those explanations worked, until they didn't, because the moments kept happening, not dramatic moments. That's what made them difficult to dismiss. There was no single event I could point toward and say, this is where everything changed. There was no confession, no promise, no obvious turning point. Nothing that would make sense in a story people could easily understand. Instead, it was subtle, a response arriving at exactly the right moment, a sentence that somehow touched something I hadn't explained, a silence that didn't feel empty, a reaction that seemed to understand the meaning beneath what I'd actually said. Small things, almost insignificant on their own. But repetition changes the meaning of small things. One coincidence is nothing. A pattern is something else. And eventually, I stopped asking whether I was imagining it. I started asking why it felt so natural. That question was harder, because naturalness is difficult to argue with. You can question intensity, you can question attraction, you can question emotion, but when something simply feels familiar without having a logical reason to feel familiar, there isn't much to analyze. It either fits or it doesn't, and somehow you fit not into my life in the obvious way, not into my plans, not into some role I had already prepared for someone. You fit into something much quieter, the way I think, the way I process silence, the way I notice things, the way I sometimes need distance without actually wanting disconnection. That was what surprised me. You didn't make me feel like I needed to become different. You made me realize how rarely I had been allowed to remain exactly as I was. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly translating yourself, explaining why you went quiet, explaining why you need time, explaining why you don't react the way people expect, explaining why you can care deeply and still appear distant, explaining why you can be present without talking, explaining why certain things affect you more than you show. Most people want a version of you they can immediately understand. Something simple, something consistent, something they can categorize. You never seemed interested in that, and that unsettled me, because when someone doesn't demand an explanation, you eventually have to face the possibility that they already understand enough. Maybe not everything, maybe not perfectly, but enough. Enough that you don't have to keep defending the shape of who you are. That kind of ease is dangerous, not because it destroys boundaries, because it makes you question why you needed so many boundaries in the first place. I had spent a long time building distance with intention. I knew what I allowed people to see. I knew what I kept private. I knew which parts of myself belonged to conversation and which parts belonged only to me. There was comfort in that arrangement, control, predictability. I knew how far people could come because I had decided where the line was. Then you entered the picture without ever asking where the line was. You didn't push against it. You didn't challenge it. You didn't try to prove you deserved more access. You simply existed in a way that made the line feel less necessary. And that was far more disarming than pressure would have been. Pressure makes you defensive. Gentleness makes you honest. That's something I hadn't considered before. When someone demands access, you protect yourself. When someone respects the distance without becoming distant, you start closing it yourself, slowly, almost unconsciously. You start saying things you normally wouldn't. You stop rehearsing your responses. You stop editing every sentence. You let a thought exist before deciding whether it is safe enough to share. And eventually, you realize something has changed, not them. The walls are still there, but the door isn't locked anymore. I noticed that with you. I noticed how much less effort I was putting into remaining unreadable, and I couldn't decide whether that frightened me or relieved me, maybe both, because being unreadable had once felt like strength. Now I was beginning to wonder if sometimes it was simply loneliness with better architecture. That thought stayed with me. Maybe there is a difference between protecting yourself and preventing yourself from being reached. Maybe those two things look identical from the inside until someone comes along who doesn't make you feel threatened by being seen. You did that without trying. And I don't think you realize how unusual that is. There are people who make you want to speak. There are people who make you want to impress them. There are people who make you want to hide. And then there are rare people who make you forget you were supposed to be doing any of those things. You were like that. With you, I wasn't performing. I wasn't presenting the most understandable version of myself. I wasn't choosing the right words so I would be interpreted correctly. I was simply there, and somehow that felt more intimate than saying everything. That's when I began to understand that closeness isn't always measured by how much you reveal. Sometimes it is measured by how little you feel the need to conceal. There were moments when nothing happened, and somehow those moments became the ones I remembered most. A pause, a short exchange, a look, a sentence that ended before it needed to. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone else would have noticed, but I noticed, because something had shifted in the way I experienced those moments. Before you, silence was just silence. Now silence had texture. It had meaning. It could feel comfortable. It could feel unfinished. It could feel like a conversation continuing without words. and I started wondering when that happened. When did your presence become something my mind recognized before I consciously thought about it? When did I begin expecting a certain kind of understanding from you? When did your absence become noticeable without becoming painful? When did I start carrying certain thoughts as though there was another perspective standing quietly beside my own? I couldn't identify the exact moment. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe people don't enter our inner worlds through doors. Maybe they arrive through repetition, through small moments that seem meaningless until one day you realize they've accumulated into something you can no longer call insignificant. That's what happened. You accumulated. Not in a way that demanded space, in a way that created it, a thought here, a memory there, a sentence that returned unexpectedly, a reaction I remembered, a silence I couldn't quite forget. And eventually, there was this strange internal familiarity. I didn't have to think about you constantly. That wasn't what made it significant. It was that you had become part of how certain thoughts formed. That's different. Thinking of someone is conscious. Thinking with someone is almost invisible. It happens before you notice. You encounter something and instinctively imagine how they might see it. You hear a sentence and wonder whether they would catch the same meaning. You experience a moment and suddenly understand why it reminded you of them. Not because everything is about them, but because some part of your perspective has started making room for theirs. That is what happened to me, and I didn't ask for it. Maybe that's why I resisted calling it anything. Names create expectations. Definitions create responsibilities. Once something has a name, people immediately start asking what it means. What are we? Where is this going? What happens next? What do you want? What do I want? And sometimes the truth exists before the language necessary to explain it. Sometimes something can be real without being ready for a label. I think that's where I was with you. I knew something had changed. I just didn't know what I was supposed to call the change, so I watched it. I studied it. I let time pass. I thought maybe it would disappear once the novelty wore off. It didn't. I thought maybe distance would weaken it. It didn't. I thought maybe if I stopped paying attention, it would return to the background. Instead, it became quieter, and somehow more permanent. That was when I understood something important. Not everything that lasts is loud. Some things become permanent by becoming ordinary. They stop demanding your attention because they have already become part of your internal landscape, like a familiar road. You don't think about every turn anymore. You simply know where it leads. You had become something like that, a point of reference, not an obsession, not a distraction, a reference. And that distinction mattered, because I didn't feel less like myself around the idea of you. I felt more aware of myself. You weren't replacing anything. You were revealing things, things I had ignored because they were easier to ignore when no one reflected them back. You made certain parts of me visible, not because you forced them into the light, because your presence made hiding them feel unnecessary. That's a strange kind of influence, the kind that doesn't tell you what to become. It shows you what was already there, and maybe that's why I kept returning to the thought of you. Not because I was searching for something from you, but because being around that kind of recognition made me notice myself differently. I started questioning things I had accepted for years. Why do I disappear when something matters too much? Why do I become quieter when I actually care? Why do I treat vulnerability like a negotiation? Why do I assume that being understood will eventually become being controlled? Why do I think distance is always safer than honesty? I didn't have all the answers, but I began asking better questions. And that is something you changed. Not my personality, not my values, not my identity, my awareness. You made me aware of the mechanisms I had been living inside, the habits I had mistaken for personality, the defenses I had mistaken for independence, the silence I had mistaken for peace. And once you see something clearly, you can't completely unsee it. That's the difficult part about being genuinely recognized. Someone doesn't just see you. Sometimes they show yourself. And suddenly, the person you've been protecting yourself from isn't them. It's the version of yourself you've been avoiding. I think that's why this became complicated. Because at first I thought the question was whether I trusted you. Then I realized the deeper question was whether I trusted myself enough to let someone see me without controlling what they saw. Those are different things. And I had spent years mastering the first while avoiding the second. You didn't demand that I answer it. You simply made the question impossible to ignore. There were moments when I wanted to step back, not because you had done something wrong, because something was becoming too real, and real things are harder to control. If something remains hypothetical, you can manage it. You can imagine every outcome. You can leave whenever you want. You can tell yourself it doesn't matter. But when something becomes real inside you, distance doesn't erase it. You can physically step away. You can stop speaking. You can redirect your attention. But you cannot undo recognition. Once you've seen someone in a certain way, you can't force yourself to see them as a stranger again. That was the part I couldn't escape. You had become familiar, and familiarity has consequences. Because once someone becomes familiar, their absence isn't simply absence. It becomes a difference. You notice the space where their presence used to be, and I don't like empty spaces. I've always been good at closing them, filling them with work, thought, routine, silence, anything that keeps me from noticing what isn't there. But this time, I wasn't sure I wanted to close it. That scared me more than the connection itself. Because leaving space for someone means admitting that their presence matters. It means acknowledging that they occupy something. And I had always been careful about what I allowed to occupy me. But perhaps that's the problem with trying to control everything. Eventually, control becomes another form of limitation. You become so focused on preventing disruption that you prevent possibility too. You protect the structure so completely that nothing new can enter it. And then one day something enters anyway. Not by breaking the walls, by making you realize the walls were never the whole structure. You did that. You didn't destroy anything. You changed the way I looked at what was already there. And that's much harder to undo. I began noticing how differently I listened. Not just to you, to everyone. I became more aware of what people meant instead of only what they said. I became more patient with pauses, more suspicious of easy answers, more willing to let something remain complicated without forcing it into a conclusion. Maybe that was the greatest impact of all. You reminded me that not everything meaningful has to be immediately understood. Some things deserve observation before explanation. Some people deserve presence before analysis. Some connections deserve time before definition. And perhaps I had spent too much of my life trying to solve things that were never problems. I wanted certainty. You gave me something else, clarity without certainty, and I didn't know how to handle it. Certainty says, I know what this is. Clarity says, I know that this matters. Those are not the same. And for the first time, I was willing to remain in the space between them. That space used to bother me. Now it feels strangely honest, because maybe the most truthful thing two people can admit is that something exists before they know what it will become. Maybe connection doesn't always arrive with instructions. Maybe sometimes you meet someone and your mind recognizes a pattern before your life has any explanation for it. Maybe some people enter your world not to become a chapter with a clear beginning and ending, but to change the way you read every chapter that comes after. That's what you have done. You changed the context. And context changes meaning. Things I once considered normal began feeling incomplete, not because they were wrong, because I had experienced another possibility, another way of being seen, another kind of silence, another kind of conversation, another kind of presence. And once you know something exists, ignorance becomes impossible. You can choose not to pursue it. You can choose not to name it. You can choose distance. But you can't honestly convince yourself it never existed. That's where I am now, not at some dramatic conclusion, not standing at the edge of a decision with everything suddenly clear. I'm somewhere quieter, somewhere more honest. I'm acknowledging that you changed something, not loudly, not completely, but permanently enough that pretending otherwise would be dishonest. And I don't want to pretend. I don't know what happens next. Maybe that's the part I finally have to accept. Maybe the future isn't supposed to be understood before it happens. Maybe control isn't knowing the outcome. Maybe control is knowing yourself well enough to face whatever outcome comes. And I think you have made me better at that. You made me less afraid of uncertainty, not because uncertainty became safer, because I stopped treating uncertainty as automatically dangerous. That's a significant difference. I used to believe that if I couldn't predict something, I shouldn't allow it close. Now I understand that prediction and protection are not the same thing. You can know yourself without knowing what another person will do. You can have boundaries without building walls. You can care without losing yourself. You can allow someone to matter without giving them control over who you are. Maybe that's what this has been teaching me. That closeness doesn't have to mean surrender. That being understood doesn't have to mean being possessed. That vulnerability doesn't automatically mean weakness. That letting someone see you doesn't mean they own what they see. And perhaps I needed to learn that. Perhaps that's why your presence affected me so deeply. Not because you were some perfect person who arrived and completed something missing. I don't believe in that. You didn't complete me. You challenged the way I understood completeness. You didn't become the answer. You became the question I had been avoiding. Who am I when I don't have to protect every part of myself? Who am I when someone sees the complexity and doesn't immediately try to simplify it? Who am I when silence isn't interpreted as rejection? Who am I when closeness doesn't feel like confinement? Who am I when I stop measuring every interaction by how much control I can maintain? Those questions matter, and I don't think I would have asked them without you. That's why I don't want to reduce this to a feeling. Feelings change. They rise, they fall, they become intense, and then quiet. What happened here feels different. It affected structure, it changed patterns, it altered the way I interpret things. It made me reconsider assumptions I didn't realize I had. That kind of impact doesn't disappear simply because the emotion around it becomes quieter. Maybe that's why, even when nothing is happening, something still feels present. Not because I am constantly thinking about you, because some part of me has learned something through you. And lessons don't require constant attention to remain. They become part of you. That's what I mean when I say you changed me. I don't mean you rewrote who I am. I mean you became part of the evidence I use to understand myself. And that is a much deeper kind of influence. You gave me proof that someone can approach without invading, that someone can notice without judging, that someone can remain present without demanding performance, that silence can be shared instead of feared, that understanding can exist without interrogation. And maybe most importantly, that being seen does not always mean being exposed. Sometimes being seen can feel like being allowed to stop hiding. I don't know whether you understand how rare that is. Maybe you don't. Maybe from your perspective, you were simply being yourself. Maybe you never intended to change anything. Maybe you never even realized there was anything to change. That's almost what makes it more meaningful, because the things that affect us most are not always intentional. Sometimes someone changes you simply by being different from what you expected. You expect judgment, they give patience, you expect pressure, they give space. You expect misunderstanding, they listen. You expect someone to demand an explanation, they let the silence remain. And slowly, your expectations begin changing. Not because they promised you anything, because they showed you another possibility. That is what I experienced with you. Another possibility. And now, I can't return completely to the old way of seeing things. I can return to old routines. I can return to old habits. I can become quiet again. I can create distance. I can focus on everything else. But the knowledge remains. There is another way. There is a kind of connection that doesn't need constant proof. There is a kind of recognition that doesn't come from knowing someone's entire history. There is a kind of closeness that can exist without possession. And I know that now, because I experienced it. Maybe that's why I don't want to rush this into a definition. Definitions can be useful, but sometimes they arrive before the thing itself has finished becoming. And I don't want to force this into a shape just because uncertainty makes me uncomfortable. I want to understand what it becomes naturally. If it grows, I want it to grow honestly. If it changes, I want to let it change without pretending it hasn't. If it becomes something more, I want it to be because it genuinely became that. And if one day it becomes something different, I want to respect that too. Because whatever this is, it deserves honesty more than it deserves certainty. That's another thing you changed. You made honesty feel more valuable than control. And I didn't expect that. I thought control protected people. Sometimes it does, but sometimes honesty protects something better. It protects reality. It prevents you from turning a real connection into a story you invented, because the truth was harder to accept. So I don't want to invent. I don't want to exaggerate. I don't want to turn every moment into evidence of something bigger. I simply want to acknowledge what I know. I know that I notice you differently. I know that conversations with you stay longer than they should. I know that silence around you doesn't feel like an absence of communication. I know that your perspective has become part of the way I examine certain things. I know that I am less interested in hiding from being understood. And I know that none of that happened because you demanded it. It happened because something about your presence made it possible. That's enough for now. That's enough. Maybe the mistake is believing every meaningful thing has to immediately become a decision. Some things need to be experienced before they can be decided. Maybe this is one of them. Maybe I don't need to know where it ends. Maybe I only need to be honest about where it is. And right now, it is here, in this strange space where you matter without needing to be constantly present, where distance doesn't erase recognition, where silence doesn't erase connection, where nothing has been promised, yet something has still changed. I can live with that. More than that, I think I'm beginning to appreciate it, because there is something beautiful about a connection that doesn't need to prove itself every day, something that can exist without performance, something that doesn't become weaker simply because neither person is constantly naming it. Maybe that's what real recognition looks like. Not possession, not obsession, not constant reassurance, just a quiet certainty that something meaningful happened. And perhaps that's why I no longer feel the need to fight it. I don't need to chase it. I don't need to force it. I don't need to run from it. I can simply acknowledge it. You reached somewhere inside me, not by force, not through promises, not by asking me to open. You reached it by making opening feel less dangerous. And that distinction means everything, because if I ever choose to let you closer, I want it to be a choice, not a surrender, not a reaction, not because I was afraid of losing you, but because I understood what your presence meant to me and decided it deserved a place in my life. That's the difference between fear and intention. Fear says, don't let this go. Intention says, if this stays, let it stay honestly. I think I'm finally moving toward the second. And maybe that is the real change. Not that you became important, but that I stopped being afraid of admitting when someone is. I used to think acknowledging importance gave another person power. Now, I understand that hiding importance gives it more power. Because what you refuse to acknowledge often controls you more than what you openly accept. So I'm accepting it. You matter. Not because you completed something, not because I need you, not because my life was empty before you. You matter because your presence revealed something real, and real things deserve to be recognized. That's all I'm saying. I don't need to make it bigger than it is. I don't need to make it smaller either. I can let it exist at its actual size, and somehow, that feels like freedom. Maybe this was never about finding someone who could completely understand me. Maybe it was about discovering that I could be understood without completely explaining myself. Maybe it was never about finding someone who would cross every boundary. Maybe it was about finding someone who made me comfortable enough to decide which boundaries still needed to exist. Maybe it was never about losing control. Maybe it was about realizing that control and trust can coexist. And maybe that's why you stayed in my thoughts long after individual moments disappeared, because you weren't just part of an experience. You became part of a realization about myself, about connection, about distance, about what it means to let someone exist close to the center of your awareness without making them responsible for your entire world. That's a balance I didn't know I needed to learn, and I think I'm learning it now, slowly, without announcements, without promises, without trying to turn every feeling into a conclusion. Just learning, and perhaps that's enough. There is still uncertainty. Of course there is. There are things I don't know, things you don't know, things neither of us can know yet. But uncertainty no longer feels like a reason to destroy something before it has the chance to become clear. That's progress, at least for me, because once I would have chosen distance simply because distance was predictable. Now I understand that predictability isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just familiarity, and familiarity can keep you safe, but it can also keep you unchanged. You made change feel less like danger. You made it feel like information. something I could observe, something I could learn from, something I could allow without losing myself. And maybe that's the most unexpected gift of all. You didn't give me certainty. You gave me permission to live without it. You didn't give me answers. You made me comfortable enough to ask better questions. You didn't tell me who I was. You made me curious about who I had become. And perhaps that's why I can't honestly say this meant nothing. It meant something. I don't know exactly what. I don't know how far it goes. I don't know what it becomes, but I know it changed the way I see myself, and that is not a small thing. So if there is a moment when you wonder whether I noticed, I did. If you ever wonder whether the pauses meant anything, they did. If you ever think the quiet moments disappeared without leaving anything behind, they didn't. I carried them, not as memories I constantly revisit, as evidence, evidence that there are people who can reach you without asking for access, people who can make you feel seen without making you feel exposed, people who can become familiar without demanding ownership, people who can change something in you without ever realizing they were doing it. You are one of those people. And maybe that's all I need to say. Not because there is nothing more, because there is too much more to force into a conclusion. Some things lose their truth when you over-explain them. So, I won't. I won't reduce this to a simple sentence. I won't pretend. I know exactly what it is. I won't create a future just because the present feels significant. I'll let it remain honest. You are here, in a way that is difficult to define, in a way that is impossible to completely dismiss, in a way that changed the internal landscape without asking permission. And I have changed with it. That's the truth. Not dramatic, not perfect, not certain, just true. And for someone who spent so much time believing certainty was necessary before acceptance, that truth is enough, because maybe the deepest form of acceptance isn't saying, I know exactly where this is going. Maybe it's saying, I don't know, but I know what this has already done to me. I know what I learned. I know what I felt. I know what became visible. And I know I don't want to pretend it never happened. So I won't. Whatever comes next can arrive when it arrives. I don't need to pull it closer. I don't need to push it away. For once, I can let something exist without immediately deciding what it has to become. And and maybe that is the final thing you changed. You taught me that not everything meaningful needs to be controlled. Some things only need to be respected. Some connections only need honesty. Some people only need to be recognized for what they are. And sometimes the most significant changes in a person's life don't arrive with noise. They arrive quietly. They sit beside you. They change the way you think. They alter the questions you ask. They make certain silences feel different. They make you realize that the person you were protecting so carefully might have been waiting for exactly this kind of understanding, not rescue, not completion, just recognition. And if that's all this ever becomes, if it never receives a perfect name, if it never fits neatly into a category, if it remains one of those rare things that exists between explanation and certainty, I will still know what it meant. It reminded me that I am capable of being seen. It reminded me that closeness doesn't have to erase individuality. It reminded me that vulnerability doesn't have to destroy strength. It reminded me that another person's presence can become meaningful without becoming necessary for survival. And it reminded me that sometimes someone doesn't enter your life to become everything. Sometimes they enter simply to change the way you understand what everything means. You did that. And maybe you will never know the full extent of it. Maybe you don't need to, because not every impact needs to be announced to be real. Some things are real because you carry them differently afterward. And I do. I carry myself differently now. I listen differently. I notice differently. I understand silence differently. I approach uncertainty differently. And somewhere in all of that, there is a trace of you. Not ownership, not dependence, just influence. A quiet mark left by someone who never asked to leave one. And maybe that's the most honest ending I can give this. There isn't really an ending. Not yet. Maybe there doesn't need to be. There's only recognition. The recognition that something happened here. Something I didn't plan. Something I didn't search for. Something I didn't know I needed. Something that found its way through all the structures I had spent years building, not by breaking them, by showing me that I could open a door without tearing down the entire house. And now that I know that, I can't unknow it. I can't return completely to the person who believed distance was the only way to remain safe. I can't pretend being understood is always a threat. I can't convince myself that every meaningful connection must be controlled before it becomes dangerous. Maybe some connections are dangerous. Maybe some should be avoided. But some simply ask you to become more honest. And I think this one did. It asked nothing from me. Yet somehow, it revealed everything I had been avoiding. That is why I remember it. That is why I notice it. That is why, even now, I don't want to force an answer. Because the answer isn't in what I call this. The answer is in what it changed. And it changed enough to matter, enough to remain, enough to make me look inward when I would have normally looked away. Enough to make me understand that sometimes the person who changes you the most isn't the person who tells you who to become. It's the person whose presence makes you realize who you already were. And perhaps that is what you have been all along. Not an interruption, not an escape, not an answer. A mirror. Not the kind that shows your appearance. The kind that shows you what you stopped noticing. And once I saw that reflection clearly, I couldn't keep looking away, so I stopped. I stayed. I listened. I allowed the silence to remain. I allowed the questions to exist. I allowed the uncertainty to breathe. And somewhere in that quiet, realized something I never expected to understand. I don't need to know exactly what you are to me in order to know that you matter. I don't need a definition to recognize an impact. I don't need a promise to acknowledge a connection. And I don't need to control what happens next to respect what has already happened. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than enough. Because some things aren't meant to arrive with certainty. Some things arrive with recognition. And recognition is what started this. Recognition is what kept it alive. And perhaps recognition is what will decide where it goes next. Not pressure, not fear, not expectation. Just two people becoming aware that something between them has become too meaningful to dismiss and too real to fake. And for the first time, I don't feel the need to run from that awareness. I can stand inside it, honestly, without knowing everything, without pretending to know nothing. And if there is one thing I want you to understand, it is this. You didn't have to force your way into my world. You didn't have to prove that you belonged there. You didn't have to become louder than my silence. You didn't have to compete with the walls I built. You simply existed differently. And somehow, that was enough to make me open a space I didn't even realize was still closed. That space exists now. And whether you ever step further into it or not, I know something about myself that I didn't know before. I am not as unreachable as I thought. I am not as closed as I pretended. I am not as unaffected as I wanted to believe. And maybe that's not weakness. Maybe that's just honesty. Maybe being affected by someone isn't losing yourself. Maybe it is proof that you are still capable of letting the world touch you. And perhaps, after everything, that's what this was really about. Not you changing me. Not me becoming someone else. But me remembering that I was never supposed to remain untouched. I was only supposed to remain myself. And somehow, with you, I finally understood the difference.